In this podcast episode, Ben Shapiro discusses the current state of college campuses in America, particularly in blue states, where administrators are catering to radical individuals who harbor anti-American sentiments. He questions why privileged students are aligning themselves with terrorist groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, chanting anti-Semitic slogans, and engaging in violent activities. He references a book by Gary S. Morrison about Russian literature, highlighting the concept of the revolutionary, who is typically from a well-off background but seeks destruction for its own sake. Shapiro explains that these privileged students lack a sense of purpose and values, leading them to join radical causes and cosplay as oppressed individuals to alleviate their guilt. He warns that these radicals may escalate their actions, potentially resorting to violence, as seen in the past with groups like the Weather Underground. He predicts that a Trump victory in 2024 could further radicalize these individuals. The podcast then delves into the recent incident at Columbia University, where protesters took over Hamilton Hall, renaming it and demanding humanitarian aid. Shapiro criticizes the protesters for their privileged backgrounds and lack of life skills, mocking their attempts to bring food into the building using makeshift methods. He highlights the involvement of Columbia professors and students in the protest, pointing out the absurdity of their actions given their academic pursuits. The NYPD eventually intervened, arresting dozens of protesters and clearing the building. Charges of burglary, criminal mischief, trespassing, and disorderly conduct were laid out against the individuals involved. Shapiro emphasizes that these protesters are likely to face expulsion, but notes that they may be readmitted and treated as heroes by the campus community. Deputy NYPD Commissioner Tariq Shepard describes the protesters as professional agitators, noting the heavy industrial chains and barricades they used to block entry into Hamilton Hall. He emphasizes the organized nature of the protest, indicating that it was not a typical student-led demonstration. Shapiro then moves on to discuss the broader issue of protests and demonstrations happening at various universities, including City College, University of North Carolina, and George Washington University. He highlights instances of violence, vandalism, and anti-American sentiment displayed by the protesters. He also mentions an incident at UCLA where protesters blocked students from attending classes and assaulted a Jewish student. The podcast also touches on the response of university administrations to the protests. Shapiro criticizes the approach of negotiating with protesters and making concessions to them instead of enforcing the law. He gives examples of Brown University and Northwestern University, where administrators agreed to meet protesters' demands in exchange for ending their demonstrations. Shapiro points out the hypocrisy of the left-wing agenda behind the protests, noting that the protesters are rebelling against America and the values that have given them privilege. He criticizes the lack of values and purpose instilled in young people by their parents and society, leading them to engage in destructive behavior. The podcast also discusses the role of the Biden administration in addressing the protests on college campuses. Shapiro highlights a statement by Miguel Cardona, the Secretary of Education, who acknowledges the possibility of withholding federal funding from schools that do not comply with Title VI regulations. However, Shapiro criticizes the administration for not taking action to enforce Title VI and hold universities accountable for allowing protests to escalate. Shapiro highlights the Democratic Party's fear of alienating the so-called youth vote, despite the fact that these low-propensity voters may not support them anyway. He points out that Joe Biden is trying to cater to these individuals, even though they may not be a significant voting bloc. The podcast delves into the actions of the Biden administration in response to the protests, with Shapiro criticizing their lack of a clear stance. He mentions instances where Biden's handlers have surrounded him to prevent him from appearing weak or stumbling, indicating a lack of confidence in the president's abilities. Shapiro discusses the protests at Columbia University, where students were calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and accusing the U.S. of supporting genocide. He criticizes the protesters for their anti-Semitic rhetoric and their lack of understanding of the situation in Gaza. He condemns Ilhan Omar, for her comments categorizing Jews as either pro-genocide or anti-genocide, calling out her lack of understanding of the complexities of the conflict. The podcast also touches on the internal divisions within the Democratic Party, with some members condemning the anti-Semitic rhetoric, while others, like Pete Aguilar, choose to downplay the issue. Shapiro highlights the hypocrisy of Chuck Schumer, a Jewish member of Congress, who fails to condemn the anti-Semitic comments made by his colleagues. Shapiro criticizes the Biden administration's proposal to bring Palestinians from Gaza to the U.S. as refugees, calling it a dangerous and misguided policy. He questions the vetting process and the potential security risks of admitting individuals from a region known for its support of terrorism. The podcast also discusses the construction of a humanitarian pier off the coast of Gaza, which could potentially put American service members at risk of being targeted by Hamas. Shapiro questions the wisdom of putting U.S. troops in harm's way in a volatile region.